Welcome to our Hoard's Dairyman monthly webinar series. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hoard's Dairyman magazine. I will serve as the host for today's program, which focuses on semen handling and tank management. Once a farm purchases straws of semen, sire fertility is left in the hands of whoever breeds the cows. Today's presentation will highlight some common mistakes when it comes to semen handling and some best management practices for protecting the investment in your nitrogen tank. Our sponsor for today's program is Select Sires, and we thank them for their support of this webinar. If you're listening to the presentation live, you have access to a PDF copy of the slides that can be printed. That handout can be found in the handout section of the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, if you have any questions for our speaker, please type them into the questions section of the control panel and we'll address them following the presentation. Today, we welcome Dr. Joe Dalton as our webinar presenter. Dr. Dalton is a professor and extension dairy specialist in animal, veterinary, and food sciences at the University of Idaho. He received his PhD degree from Virginia Tech. Dr. Dalton's research and extension program in applied male and female reproductive physiology focuses on factors important to increasing the efficiency of artificial insemination in cattle. For Hoard's Dairyman readers, his name may sound familiar, as Dr. Dalton is also an author for our artificial breeding column in the magazine. Dr. Dalton, welcome to the webinar, and I look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled Back to the Basics, Semen Handling and Tank Management.
Thank you very much, Abby. It's wonderful to be here, and thanks to Select Sires for sponsoring this webinar. Just a little bit of an outline of where we're going today and what we're going to discuss. We're going to start with a little bit about semen packaging and semen storage, and then we will talk for quite a while on semen handling and site of semen deposition, finishing up with batch thawing and multiple straw thawing of semen straws. Okay, so on this slide we have a picture of straws, goblets, and a cane, and we are moving from left to right. We have 5 straws, 0.5 ml size, and then we have in the middle, we have the plastic goblet, and then we have the cane on the right-hand side. And in general, when we're using 0.5 ml straws, we would have 5 of these straws within the top goblet and 5 of these straws within the bottom goblet. And both of these goblets then would be affixed to a metal cane. And at the top of the cane is where we can read the code for the bull whose semen is attached to that cane. And when we have the system all put together, it essentially looks like this. This is a cane with 10 0.5 ml straws. Once again, 5 on the top goblet and 5 on the bottom goblet. Now, we do not only have a system that allows for half mil or 0.5 ml straws. Certainly 0.25 ml straws or quarter mil straws are very popular throughout the world. So we want to understand that semen handling is essentially the same whether we're looking at 0.25 ml straws or 0.5 ml straws. One of the questions, though, that I get very often and that many people have is what's the relative difference between the 2 package sizes in fertility? Over the years, there has been a lot of discussion as to whether there is an increase in fertility in one size or the other size. And we can see in this slide a publication from Dr. Jeff Stevenson. And Jeff is a former professor emeritus currently at Kansas State University, and also used to write for Hoard's Dairyman in the artificial breeding column for many years. And Jeff did a meta-analysis, which is essentially an aggregation of data from multiple studies, and they looked at pregnancy outcome or fertility after AI of frozen thawed bovine semen packaged in either 0.5 ml straws or 0.25 ml straws. There were nearly 800,000 inseminations. There was large variation among studies, but what it all boils down to is that the 0.25 ml straw may provide an actual difference in pregnancy outcome of less than 1%. So in essence, our ability to see a difference on an individual farm basis will likely not happen between a 0.5 and a 0.25 ml straw, so long as semen handling and storage are appropriate. Okay? So essentially we have two product package sizes. Both of them provide excellent storage and fertility potential. And I just wanted to make sure that we understood that moving forward. Okay, so getting into the semen storage portion of the webinar, essentially we have our liquid nitrogen storage tank shown here. It is a tank within a tank, and in between the two tanks, there's a vacuum space and insulation. And we have an inner shell, and that inner shell is the one that holds the liquid nitrogen. And then we have canisters that hang down, and these canisters then will hold the canes of semen. And we have, the next thing I'd like to talk about is this idea of the neck tube. The neck tube is actually here, and it's very fragile, and we want to make sure that we understand that although the tank looks very durable, and it is, the neck tube is actually very fragile. So we want to be careful not to drop the tank. We want to be careful to secure the tank when we're moving it in a vehicle of any kind. And we want to make sure that we have an appropriate stopper in the neck tank to stop liquid nitrogen from evaporating through that neck tube. Okay, and then the last thing that beginning AI technicians struggle with is this index spider on the bottom of the tank. And essentially, it is a spacer on the bottom of the tank to allow canisters to have a unique location where they are stored, so that when we move the tank, the canisters don't swing wildly and cause damage to the inside of the tank. Relative to actual storing of semen in the tank, it's very important that we monitor liquid nitrogen levels across time. And usually every couple of days, it's a good idea to take a dipstick, and it can be a centimeter stick or it can be a yardstick, and we can essentially place that through the neck till it touches the bottom of the tank. And then when we remove that and shake it in the air, we will get a frost line on the centimeter or yardstick, and we'll be able to tell how much liquid nitrogen is in the tank. From a standpoint of inches, we'd want to maintain a minimum of about 10 inches of liquid nitrogen in the tank. And we would want to make sure that we fill the tank at regular intervals. And this can be done by working with our AI supplier and having our AI supplier routinely come by the farm or come by the location where we have our tanks, so that they can routinely add liquid nitrogen to our tanks so that we don't go low. We want to make sure that we understand how the tanks work and what happens relative to the ambient environment and the ability of us to keep semen frozen. So we want to recognize that there's temperature variation within the neck of semen tanks. As shown here, this is a tank that has had the stopper removed. And as we can see, there's a 6-inch neck on this particular tank. And if we are down at the bottom portion of the neck, the temperature is pretty close to the liquid nitrogen temperature. It's about minus 292 Fahrenheit to minus 313 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as we go towards the outside environment, if we go halfway to approximately the 3rd inch, we're at a minus 103 degrees Fahrenheit to minus 116 degrees Fahrenheit. And then if we go up to the very, very top of the tank, we can see that now we are actually positive. So we're positive 36 degrees Fahrenheit to about positive 54 degrees Fahrenheit. And that shows essentially the effect of removing the stopper, and it shows the impact of the ambient environment relative to temperatures within the neck of the tank. The importance of this is that we know from research that sperm injury occurs at minus 110 degrees Fahrenheit. And we also know that injury to sperm cannot be corrected by returning semen to liquid nitrogen. Sperm do not have a mechanism that allows them to repair damage to membranes. So as we are looking at this slide and we're looking for, gee, where is that minus 110 degrees? In this particular graph, it would be in that 3 to 4 inch range. We can see that by the numbers that are listed on the screen. And what we would want to do is we would always want to work below the frost line within the tank to ensure that we're able to maintain the frozen sperm at an optimal temperature. So that's what we're showing in this particular slide, titled Always Work Below the Frost Line. And we are looking into a liquid nitrogen storage tank. We can see 2 canes. They are listed there. You can read the code and the bull's name on there. And these are just practice straws, but it gives you the idea of what we're talking about working below the frost line. You can see the frost line in the neck, and I can highlight that with this circle. Everything below that as we look in is below the actual frost line. And what we want to do is we want to keep the canister and all the contents of the canister, all those canes below the frost line, even the cane that we're working with. And this, in this case, we would work with this cane because this is the cane that has, it looks like about 4 straws within that top goblet. So what we could do is we could access those straws by using tweezers. And then that way we do not insult those straws that we are not using to breed cows at this particular time. So just a few pictures here to kind of hit home what we're talking about relative to semen handling. This is a picture that was in a magazine many, many years ago. And it says winning reproductive strategies. And we can see there's a technician removing or showing a cane. And in the other hand, the right hand, this technician is holding some tweezers. And the title is, What's Wrong with This Picture? Well, what's wrong with this picture is we can see that there are actually straws in that top goblet. And that top goblet is completely exposed to the ambient environment. And even for a few seconds, this is extremely detrimental. As I mentioned, sperm get damaged when they're not thawed appropriately. And certainly this is an insult to sperm, and we wouldn't want to do this. The other thing that I haven't mentioned that we need to recognize is when we engage in poor semen handling, the straw that we actually remove is the straw that is least affected. It's the straws that we don't remove that end up getting an additive effect on the second, third, fourth, fifth time that we mishandle semen. So there's an additive injury rate to sperm. So again, what we want to do is we always want to handle semen appropriately, regardless of whether we're thawing one straw or more than one straw. So this picture is not a good idea, not even for a picture. It was a bad idea. This is another one that was in a national magazine a few years ago. Again, even for a picture, this is a bad idea. This is showing a lot of canes very high in the neck, and we would have beginnings of injuries certainly to the semen or to the sperm cells that are shown or that are within those straws. Within this picture, we kind of have a different situation. So we have a stopper above a neck of a tank or in the neck of the tank, but the stopper is very old and it looks like it's been chewed on by a dog. This is not a good idea, okay, especially when we can see snow coming out of the tank. That means there is evaporation of liquid nitrogen, and that's shown in those two red circles there. And then anytime we have to put a screw inside a stopper to ensure that the stopper doesn't fall into the bottom of the tank, it's time to buy a new stopper. Okay, new stoppers can be relatively inexpensive, and the relative nature of that is to the value of the semen inside the tank. Okay, a stopper might be $10 to $80 depending upon the source, but within any of our liquid nitrogen semen storage tanks, we have thousands of dollars worth of semen. So always a good idea to make sure that we have a good stopper and not a stopper that's shown here. And here we go, one more picture of a tank that has snow on the top of it. This is a tank with a broken neck. And even if you have a source of liquid nitrogen, this is a bad idea. This is a tank that is losing liquid nitrogen at a fast rate and should be decommissioned. We shouldn't be using this tank anymore. One of the things that I want to make sure we recognize, and not only for those of us that may own or manage the dairy, but certainly for those that are working and breeding the cows for us, we want to make sure that all of our employees understand that liquid nitrogen is dangerous. You can get burned with liquid nitrogen. There are many, many ways to work with liquid nitrogen in a safe manner and an efficient manner, and that's where we should focus, understanding that it can hurt us if we don't manage it appropriately. So there are many people who choose to wear gloves when handling semen. That is a great idea. There are also other people that choose to use tweezers to remove semen. That's another very good idea. We just want to make sure that we understand that liquid nitrogen is dangerous and the safety of everyone using a liquid nitrogen storage system is paramount. Okay, so let's move on a little bit and talk a little bit about the AI equipment and talk about specific aspects of semen handling and deposition. So here we have a great picture which shows all the pieces that we need to complete the necessary task of AI. We have a storage tank shown in the middle of that picture with the blue cap on it, and there are tweezers and there are two thaw boxes on the right. Within the thaw boxes are thermometers. There certainly are scissors. The insemination guns are ahead of the green gloves shown there. And then we have disposable arm sleeves in the extreme left. Paper towels are shown in the bottom left. And there's smaller bottles of lubricant shown there. And you can also see there's a light and a pump over there for more lubricant. So what I usually tell people is this is the type of system when you develop how you're going to breed cows, you should make sure that it makes sense to you. If it makes sense to you to move in a clockwise direction or a counterclockwise direction, to have everything that as it's shown here, I say more power to you. That's the best thing you can do, the smartest thing you can do. The worst thing any technician can do is to be scatterbrained and to be wasting time looking for something. Where's the gun? Where's the tweezers? Where's the sheaths? That's the last thing we want to do. A lot of forward thinking will make the process go very smoothly, and it will make us be able to retain the fertility that's inherent in the straws that we purchased, and to generate those pregnant cows and heifers that we want and that we need for our business. Every successful AI program begins with proper semen handling. Okay, I would argue that. Okay, there are many factors that play a role in successful AI programs, but we're focusing today on proper semen handling. And there are 4 things that I want everyone to consider and to remember. We need to be aware of time, temperature, hygiene, and skill. Okay, and we're going to go over each and every one of those. But before we do that, I want to show you and talk a little bit more about this picture here. This is a breeder that I worked with many years ago on a research project. And within a trailer that this gentleman pulled behind his pickup truck, he had everything he needed, all the tools he needed to breed cows. And you can see that the layout makes perfect sense to him. Okay, you can see there are multiple thaw baths, the blue thaw baths in the center. There's tweezers and scissors. There's a towel dispenser. Look at the size of the clock on the wall. There's no guessing as to how long he's thawing semen. He's got a functional clock with the second hand on there. And then another thing that I really like is the inventory of each canister is shown on the side of the tank. So there's no searching in the tank of where is the semen for this dairy or this particular bull. And we can all do that. We can do that in a variety of ways. We can have it in a phone. We can have it on an iPad, have it on a graph that's taped to the wall of the office, whatever makes sense to you. But the last thing we want to do is open the cap and start searching for where's that cane of bull A. Okay, so we want to plan ahead. Okay, so we had time, temperature, hygiene, and skill. Let's talk about the importance of time and temperature. In the first bullet point shown there, if we have half-mill semen straws and they are thawed appropriately at 35 to 37 degrees Celsius or 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and then if they're held for 15 minutes at that same temperature, 35 to 37 degrees or 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, there's no difference in mean progressive sperm motility from the initial motility taken initially right after thawing until 15 minutes. So essentially, we're doing what we need to do. We're maintaining motility, okay? On the other hand, in that second bullet point, if we take 0.5 ml semen straws and we thaw them appropriately, but we hold them for 15 minutes at room temperature, which is approximately 22 degrees C or about 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit, we get a decrease in mean progressive sperm motility. Again, from that initial motility after initial thawing, after 15 minutes, we get a decrease in sperm motility. This is not what we want. Okay, maintenance of temperature is incredibly important. This is why I urge technicians to keep the loaded AI gun close to their body within their coveralls. And this is why there has been development of many good battery pack systems where you can carry AI guns within a battery pack at an appropriate temperature. Okay. This is just a slide showing that we want to thaw straws in 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 to 37 degrees C water for approximately 45 seconds. And we want to make sure that we check these card thermometers with another thermometer just to make sure that they are accurate. So we've talked about time and temperature. Now we're going to talk about hygiene. This is a very simple concept. We see the technician here has paper towel. The paper towel will wipe the vulva. We don't need to wipe the vulva 3, 4, 5, 6 times, a couple of times on a downward motion, and then we can drop the paper towel and in one motion remove the gun from our coveralls and insert it into the cow. Okay, notice there's, within this particular picture, there's not manure everywhere. This is a process that we can do very cleanly. We should do very cleanly. And if we pay attention to detail and move at the appropriate time, we can have very good hygiene. Okay, let's spend a little bit of time on that last bullet point. We've talked about time, temperature, and hygiene. Let's talk about inseminator skill. We're going to talk about deposition of semen into the uterine body of the cow, as shown here in this graph, courtesy of Select Sires. Many, many times there are questions as to where should semen be deposited for AI. In a recent article that I had in Hordes Dairyman, I talked a little bit about that, about location of semen deposition. And we can see within this table shown here, there are 7 different research studies. And in these research studies, cows that received AI in the uterine body were compared to cows that received AI in uterine horns, and their fertility, relative fertility, was analyzed. And as we can see, there's about 3 studies that saw an increase in fertility when semen was deposited in the uterine horns. And then there were 3 studies that showed no increase. And there was one particular study right in the middle that showed in some technicians there's an increase, and in other technicians there's not an increase. So essentially, the jury is still out. There is not consensus that there's an increase in fertility when we deposit semen in the uterine horns. And really, this data causes me to think about something else, something that's even deeper, not deeper, something that's even a little bit different than the question we're looking at here. And as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking, well, why do some studies show an increase in fertility following uterine horn deposition? You know, why do we see that? And why do other studies not show it? And really what it comes down to is we need to understand how deposition of semen into the cervix actually affects fertility. And the reason I say this is because we know from research that there's a 10% decrease in fertility when we deposit semen in the cervix as compared to deposition in the uterine body. And we know that cervical deposition of semen occurs in 20% of attempted uterine body depositions. So really the focus should not be on the uterine horns versus the uterine body. My argument is the focus should be on cervical deposition versus uterine body. We should always be striving to deposit semen in the uterine body. And when we do that, we will eliminate the decrease in fertility due to cervical deposition of AI, and which we know is a problem and results in lower fertility. So there's been a variety of studies over the years looking at site of deposition in cows, looking in this particular study from University of Minnesota, looking at the site of dye deposition in cows. And as we can see, we have two different fertility level of technicians, less than 70% non-return rate in the center, and greater than 78% non-return rate on the far right. And essentially, those two categories are the center. One would be the lower fertility technicians, less than 70% non-return, and then the one to the extreme right, greater than 78% non-return, would be the higher fertility technicians. And what we're showing in this graph, if we look at all the different sites of deposition, the uterine body, the right horn, left horn, anterior cervix, posterior cervix, and the vagina, you can see where the percentage placement occurred. Now, keep in mind, these technicians were asked to place the dye, which was inside an AI gun, to place it within the reproductive tract at the appropriate spot. They were asked to put it in the uterine body. And as we can see, those lower fertility technicians shown in that center column, only 34% were able to place the dye in the uterine body, as compared to the 86% of the higher fertility technicians. 31% of the lower fertility technicians placed the dye in the right horn, and 4% placed it in the left horn, where we can see those higher fertility technicians, 14% placed it in the right horn, but 0% in the left. And then we can see as we go down the anterior cervix, posterior cervix, and the vagina are locations where those lower fertility technicians placed semen. And if we look at the higher fertility column on the far right, we can see that none of them placed semen in the cervix, anterior or posterior, or the vagina. So this is not necessarily a huge mystery as to a very, very large contributing factor to decreased fertility in these lower fertility technicians, because we can see from this study that the intended site of deposition was much lower than what we had desired. And then on the other side of the coin, we can see why those technicians do very well in the far right, because they are very accurate in depositing semen in the uterine body, with only a small percentage actually going a little bit too far into the right horn. So moving on into this idea of multiple straw thawing or batch thawing, and usually when we are together and in person, I usually ask this question, how many straws should be thawed at one time? And, should it be, is there a magic number? Should we do 2 or 1 or 14? What is that? Well, one of the things that we have to consider is everything we've already talked about. And the way I like to phrase it is, just because we have 10 cows to breed on a particular day or 200 cows to breed on a particular day doesn't mean we can break the rules. All the rules that we've talked about still need to be maintained, and they need to be maintained so that we are able to generate pregnancies today and in the future from the semen that we've purchased and that we're storing within our liquid nitrogen storage tanks. So the answer is, how many straws should be thawed at one time? It kind of depends. And it depends on a lot of different factors. So we're going to go ahead and discuss that a little bit more. We did some study a few years back on the effect of sequential insemination number on conception rates. And essentially what we did is we had two groups of AI technicians shown here. In maroon, we had professional AI technicians, and in orange, we had herdsman technicians or do-it-yourselfers, okay? And you can see we have conception rate on one axis, and then we have sequential insemination number, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And all that means is that the number 1 is associated with animals that were inseminated first in a sequence of 4 successive inseminations. Number 2 would be the animal that was inseminated second. Number 3, third, fourth, 4 would be the fourth one. And as we can see from this data, we have the maroon bars overall are higher than the orange bars. So we did see an effect of professional AI technicians versus herdsman technicians, but we did not see an effect of sequential insemination number on fertility. What that means is, in this particular study, there was no effect of whether we thawed 4 straws together on the fertility of the first AI, second, third, or fourth cow in a sequence. Now, this should not be interpreted as license to run out into the farmyard and breed 4 cows or to thaw 4 straws, load 4 guns, and breed 4 cows, because there's much more involved in it than that we're going to talk about, okay? We have to understand, go back to this idea of time. And in that particular study that we're talking about, we also monitored time and elapsed time from initial thaw to first and fourth AI, where 4 straws were thawed simultaneously. We can see in the middle column, we have the professional inseminators, and in the right-hand column, we have the herdsman inseminators. And we can see the elapsed time to completion of the first AI for professionals was 4.2 minutes. For herd managers, it was 5.8 minutes. The elapsed time to completion of the fourth AI for professionals was 7.6 minutes, and for herd managers, it was 10.9 minutes. So these groups of technicians are doing an excellent job in being time efficient and getting semen placed in cows within 10 to 15 minutes. And that's really the range we want to be in. If we look at a much larger data set for sequential insemination number, and we can see there are thousands of inseminations shown here, relative fertility is equal across the first 4 straws. Again, this does not provide license for anyone to thaw 4 straws and to expect equivalent fertility, because there are other factors that play a role. But when we can control time, temperature, hygiene, and skill, when we can deposit semen within 10 to 15 minutes, then we do have the ability to thaw more than one straw at a time. So going back to that original question, how many straws should be thawed at one time? First bullet point is the take-home message. No more than can be used in 10 to 15 minutes. And everyone should know their comfort zone. Because if we thaw straws in an office and then we take 7, 8, 9 minutes or more to get to the first cow, we need to be really careful about how many straws we're going to thaw and how many guns we're going to load. We also need to recognize how long it takes us to load guns. If we were perhaps to load 4 guns, but it took 10 minutes to load 4 guns, that's not a good idea to carry 4 guns, because by the time we get to the cows and deposit the semen, we will likely be outside the 10 to 15 minute window. We want to ensure that we do not allow straws to touch when thawing. We know from research that if we allow straws to touch when thawing, it causes damage to sperm and results in reduced fertility. So that's why if we're in a situation where we were going to thaw multiple straws, we would want to have multiple thaw baths, and we'd also want to gently swirl the straws when we drop them in the water so they stay apart. And we can also use the temperature card to separate straws within an individual thaw bath. We want to remember time, temperature, hygiene, and skill. With the development of sex semen and its adoption since 2006 in the US and also throughout the world, we have to recognize that sex semen is not the same as conventional semen. Even in 2022, it is a different product. And we want to make sure that we handle it appropriately so that we can get that return on investment, so we can generate those pregnant animals and those calves that are highly desired for our business. And this graph is a graph of some ABS Global research that was done a few years back. And it shows progressive motility on one axis, and it shows on the other axis a time since thawed in 0, 5, 10, or 15 minutes. And essentially, what this study shows is that when semen is thawed appropriately, again, 35 to 37 degrees Celsius or 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it's held at the appropriate temperature, and that would be the green line, the first line. Across 15 minutes, there's very little decrease in progressive motility in this study. We can see a little bit, but there's very little decrease in progressive motility with sex semen. On the other hand, when we thaw it appropriately, but we hold it in a heat shock situation, which would be 42.2 degrees C or 108 degrees Fahrenheit, that would be the yellow line, the second line down, that's labeled heat shock, we can see that there is a greater slope to the line and a decrease in sperm motility from 0 to 15 minutes. And that decrease is much greater than if we handled it appropriately in the green line. Now, if we look down to the red line, which represents cold shock, that is semen that's thawed appropriately, but then is held at 4.4 degrees C or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And we can see it's the slope is much different than even the heat shock slope, and certainly radically different than the green line, which is appropriate handling and maintenance of temperature. So what does this tell us? This is telling us that sex semen packaged in 0.25 ml straws is very sensitive to semen handling errors. And really, to guard against those semen handling errors, we shouldn't be using the 10 to 15 minute rule that I mentioned earlier when we thaw semen and breed cows. That's for conventional semen. We really need to be in the 5 to 8 minute range with sex semen. So thaw no more straws than you can breed cows within 5 to 8 minutes. And remember, the timing begins as soon as the first straw hits the thaw bath. And you have to include loading of guns and walking to the cows or the heifers, and all the way up until the last gun is inseminated into a cow. So what, once again, this is showing is we want to move to the left, and we want to use about a 5 to 8 minute time period for ensuring that we can gain that return on our investment on sex semen. So we're going to go ahead and round the corner, and we're heading for home here. What is a summary of the AI process? Very simple. We want to maintain an accurate semen inventory, and we want this to be held outside of the tank. It can be on a computer, a phone, iPad, taped to the wall, however it makes sense to you. Of course, we want to restrain the animal to receive AI, and we want to do that first. Before we thaw the semen, locate all your necessary items. Make sure you've got them, whether it's in the back of a pickup, it's in a gator, or it's in a razor, or it's in an office. Check the water bath temperature. Make sure it is at the appropriate temperature. Using tweezers, work below the frost line to remove the straw from the tank. Thaw semen in warm water, 95 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 35 to 37 degrees Celsius for 45 seconds. Remove the straw and dry the straw thoroughly. It's very important that straws are dried thoroughly, as we know that water will damage sperm and kill sperm. So we want to dry the straw thoroughly. We want to ensure that we've covered the straw and that the straw is not exposed to the environment, whether it's inside the office or it's outside. And we want to load that straw into a warmed gun, cut the crimped end of the straw, that's the sealed end of the straw, and pull the sheath over the assembled gun and secure it. Place that assembled gun close to your body to maintain temperature, and certainly, as mentioned previously, you can use battery pack devices, battery gun warmers work very well for this purpose. Pull on a sleeve, make sure you get lube, and bring paper towels with you. And there you go, you're going to insert your arm into the rectum, wipe the vulva clean, and begin the process. Insert the gun into the cow, manipulate the cervix over the gun, and deposit semen in the uterine body. And make sure that you keep accurate records, the date of the AI, the cow, bull, and tech ID, and also whether this was AI after a heat or if it was part of a timed AI program. And then we want to make sure that we do routine pregnancy or open checks on all our animals so that we can have data relative to our success in generating those pregnancies, and also relative to how we need to manage the open animals so that we can get them in calf. So the final take-home message here, time, temperature, hygiene, and skill. That's what we want to focus on when we are doing the procedure of artificial insemination in cattle. I'd be happy to answer any questions now. That's the end of the formal webinar.
Thank you, Dr. Dalton, for that presentation. I think you did an excellent job laying out the groundwork for really maintaining semen quality and then getting cows inseminated. So thank you for covering the basics on a very important process that happens on every dairy farm. Also, I'd like to thank Select Sires for sponsoring this program. We really appreciate their support of our webinar series. If you'd like to listen to this webinar again or share it with someone else, it could be a great teaching tool for the people that are breeding cows on your farm. You can find it on our archives later this week, and you can also find all of our archived webinars at our website, hordes.com, and there's a webinar tab. So feel free to check those out there. I'd also like to invite you to our future webinars. We are wrapping up the 2022 season and looking ahead to 2023. We will kick off our webinars in January with a dairy situation and outlook. That presentation will be given by Mark Stevenson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the sponsor for that webinar will be QLF, Quality Liquid Feeds. Then in February, we will have Dr. Amelia Willems from Mississippi State University talking to us about immunity in calves. So we hope that you have enjoyed the webinars that we have presented this year, and we look forward to hosting you for some future webinars in 2023. Now, we did have one question that came in advance, so that is on this upcoming slide. And then I would encourage you to type in your questions in the questions section of the control panel, and we will address those very soon. So, Dr. Dalton, I'll read through this one. It's a little bit of a longer kind of story question here. I'll read through that, and then you can go ahead with your answers. So, this question came from us from Sweden. It says, if a semen tank leaks or the nitrogen level gets low, what should a farmer do? Is it worth sending some straws to a semen lab to have it checked? And what will that testing say or show about the remaining straws that are still in the tank? Even if sperm are motile and morphologically okay, could there still be damage? Is it worth using that semen in a few cows to test it? Although that is a longer process, waiting to see if those cows get pregnant or not. Or would the best advice be to discard all the straws and start over? So even though one straw might not be that expensive, but the delay in conception rate for several cows could be costly and obviously affects the long-term herd dynamics. So if you would share your thoughts on that question.
Sure, this is a very good question. I'm glad that this question was asked. So the first thing that I want to answer with this is yes, is it worth sending some straws to a semen lab to have it checked? I think in general that is a good process. Now I have to qualify that because nitrogen tank level getting low can be open to interpretation. So if the tank is dry, or if it has very little, if it has an inch worth of liquid nitrogen or so in the bottom of the tank, very little liquid nitrogen, essentially that semen should be discarded. So there's a little bit of wiggle room there to understand what the particular situation is on the farm. But having said that, if it's not that extreme and a producer believes that there still could be some viable semen in there, it's entirely possible that you could send some straws to a local veterinary school. You could send them to a local agricultural school. You could also contact the supplier, and the supplier can come out and check your tank. Okay, so yes, that's a reasonable thing to do. When you get a report, when someone gets a report of the semen analysis, they're going to look at motility, they would look at morphology, a variety of things. What does that mean? Well, that's going to be relative to the quality control that was done at the AI Center, and it's done at all AI centers, as to whether the semen retains the fertility level that it had when it left the AI Center. I do not generally recommend thawing the straws and breeding cows and taking that risk of them not getting pregnant, because there's a huge time interval necessary there. And there's also many, many different factors that play a role in whether cows get pregnant or not, and that just is not a good idea. So that's kind of how I would answer that. There's many different perhaps qualifying pieces to this. But in general, when tanks go very low, when tanks leak, and certainly we know when tanks go dry, all that semen should be discarded. Okay, but there are avenues, if it is not an extreme case, where you could have semen evaluated. But certainly what you would want to do is you would want to stop using the semen, and you would want to use an alternative source in the meantime to make sure that you are not using potentially damaged semen.
Thank you for addressing that group of questions. One more question about a nitrogen tank. What would you recommend as the best place to store a nitrogen tank on the farm?
Okay, another really good question. We want to store a liquid nitrogen tank usually on a farm in an office. Okay, we want to have routine temperature, so an ambient temperature that's appropriate. And I'm thinking, you know, in most offices, you have either heaters or air conditioners, depending upon where you are. And there's in general a room temperature where you can store the tank. And that being approximately 20 degrees to 22 C or 70 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And you would want to store it up above concrete. You don't want it necessarily on concrete or on wet concrete. There are some issues with leaching of minerals outside of the concrete, which can damage the outer covering of the tank. So we don't want to store it in a wet area. And we don't want to store it in, let's say, the milk house, where we can have very, very high temperatures during, let's say, cleaning, during the cleaning cycle, where we get a lot of fog, a lot of humidity. That's generally not a good idea. So usually is the office is the best location, because we're maintaining the environment and we're not stressing out the tank essentially.
All right, thank you for that answer. Next question. If you are about to inseminate a cow and you notice cloudy discharge, should you proceed with AI or not?
Okay, another good question. So you do always want to make sure that anything that you see, that you can keep track of it. So for example, if this animal was an animal that was diagnosed in or observed in estrus, you would want to write that down, or if she's a timed AI animal, etc. You would also want to keep records of whether you find mucus, in this case, if it's cloudy or if it's very clear, etc. To keep things, I think the best way to look at it is to keep things in a systems kind of approach. My recommendation in this case would be to continue to inseminate that animal, but to make a notation of what was seen. And the reason for that is, if we don't inseminate that animal at that particular time, then we have increased the number of days until she has another opportunity to become pregnant. And we have to be mindful that time to pregnancy after calving is an important event for the health of the dairy business. So in this case, how the question was phrased to me, I would suggest inseminating the animal. I would suggest writing down the observations and then monitoring that animal across time for return to estrus. And if she doesn't return to estrus, then she would go into a pregnancy or open check situation.
Okay. Our next question, do you know of any research on using a sheath protector versus not using one?
Yeah, there has been a variety of research on using sheath protectors. And there is some data that shows within different groups of animals there to be some benefit. However, across all animals, when we're looking at heifers, first lactation, second lactation, 3+ lactation cows, there is not a uniform improvement in fertility when using sheath protectors. So, can you use them? Should you use them? That becomes a personal choice. That becomes a choice relative to an expectation of a return on the investment for those sheath protectors. The data that I mentioned is not a does not show a universal benefit for all animals used. So that's probably why we don't see universal use of sheath protectors. But they do serve a purpose, certainly. They can help in situations where we are concerned with perhaps dragging some increased level of bacteria or something into the cervix and into the uterus. And in those situations, they work well. I just want to make sure that I answer the question. There is data out there, but it's not uniform across all animals, whether there's a benefit or not.
Okay, thank you for that. If you could just advance the slide one
yes.
forward, Dr. Dalton, no problem. Now we have a few questions here about sex semen. The first one is there any difference in the time required for thawing straws of sex semen versus conventional semen?
Great question. No, there is not. Sex semen, you can thaw at 95 to 98 Fahrenheit or 35 to 37 degrees Celsius for a minimum of 45 seconds. And that is recommendations that are optimized, if you will, for the types of semen packaging that we're dealing with, which in sex semen is 0.25 ml straws. And it also has to do with the components that are within the extender that help semen survive the freezing and thawing process. So in essence, no, we thaw and we load the guns the same with sex semen.
Okay, and then kind of along those same lines, is there a difference in sperm loss per second at room temperature between sex semen and conventional semen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that there's an increased loss per unit time in a head-to-head between conventional and sex semen. I don't know the answer to that. I go back to the graph that I showed that was ABS Global data on the blue slide that showed sex semen that was maintained in temperature for 15 minutes versus cold shock and heat shock. And that's the slide really that hits home for me, that tells me that I need to recognize that sex semen is a little bit different product and that I can really help gain the return on my investment if I use a shorter window of time from 5 to 8 minutes approximately from thaw to deposition in the cow, as opposed to treating it like conventional semen.
Okay, thank you. And a little bit different question, how long can properly stored semen or embryos be frozen and remain viable? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. So as long as the tank has not been damaged and the tank has sufficient liquid nitrogen in the tank, we can freeze semen and keep semen frozen for decades. There are many, many instances of people going back into the vault, so to speak, and using a tank of a bull that's long since dead and having no problems generating calves. And really what that goes to is the freezing and the storage process. So by freezing semen appropriately, and once it's frozen, maintaining it in the frozen state, it essentially is in a suspended animation state. Then when we remove it, let's say it's 2 decades later, we remove it and we thaw it appropriately, the expectation and the reality is that those sperm thaw and come back to a metabolic state of progressive motility and have the ability to fertilize. And I would expect the same to be true for embryos. Again, so long as they were appropriately frozen and they are appropriately stored, the expectation should be decades.
Yes, I've heard, a few stories like you mentioned, and it's pretty amazing how long that product can last and still be viable, like you said, if stored correctly. One final question here. If someone was going to purchase a used nitrogen tank, like how would you recommend they ensure that it is properly functioning, or how do you make sure your nitrogen tank is working appropriately?
Okay. So certainly there's opportunities to buy equipment, either new or used. I think there has to be a concerted thought process as to the relative value of buying something new versus buying something used. I certainly understand that in many cases, many businesses don't have the budget to purchase new equipment. And in this case, if we're buying a used piece of equipment, we would want to make sure of the holding capacity of the tank. What I mean by that is every tank has or is rated by a number of weeks. Some tanks will be 8-week tanks, meaning they can hold nitrogen for 8 weeks or 12 or 20 weeks, etc. And if we have access to a tank that we are considering purchasing, it would be advantageous to us to have the tank filled with liquid nitrogen and then to understand the loss of liquid nitrogen across time. That would be an easy way to tell us, well, this tank is losing liquid nitrogen rapidly over the first 4, 5, 6 days. There's no reason to buy that tank, as opposed to an alternative sequence where we checked the liquid nitrogen level in this tank across time, and we could see that it was holding liquid nitrogen across time very well with appropriate declines over 6 to 8 to 12 to 20 weeks. Okay, that's one way of going about it. But I kind of caution people against purchasing used liquid nitrogen tanks. The reason I do is because a new liquid nitrogen tank can be purchased from multiple suppliers for about $600 US, and these tanks can hold 600-700 straws. So relatively speaking to the value of the semen and the value of pregnancies to our business, I would argue it would be better to purchase a new tank. because of the expectation of that value and that return on investment. But having said that, I did answer the question and how you might go about kind of testing out a used tank that someone else wants to sell. But in general, we need to understand that potential value of those pregnancies to our business, and it might be worth it. I would argue it is worth it to make sure that we have the best equipment available to us.
Well, thank you for that advice. Certainly appreciated. And that is the end of our question section here. I want to thank all of our audience members who typed in their questions, and thank you to you, Dr. Dalton, for the careful and thoughtful answers that you provided. I want to invite everyone to our future webinars. Again, they will take place on the second Monday of each month in 2023. In January, we will have a presentation focusing on the dairy situation and outlook for the year ahead. And then in February, we'll be talking about immunity in calves. So if you would mark your calendar and make plans to attend these future webinars if the topics interest you. And then once again, I want to thank Select Sires for their support of this webinar. If you want to move ahead one more slide, that would be great. If you would like to learn more about Select Sires, please feel free to check them out online. But again, we really are appreciative of them sponsoring this particular webinar. Also, thank you to Dr. Dalton for the useful tips you shared today that will help all of our listeners get cows bred on their farms or the farms they work with. So thank you very much. And of course, I want to thank all the listeners out there who made time to tune in to today's show. We, our team here at Hoard's Dairyman, wants to wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And we look forward to meeting with you again in 2023. So until next time, please take care. Hope you all stay healthy and have a good holiday season. And we'll look forward to seeing you on a future webinar. So goodbye and thank you from all of us here at Hoard's Dairyman to you, wherever you're listening today.
Thank you.